May 10th, 1945. Berlin lay in ruins. The Reich Chancellery smoldered beneath a sky choked with ash. 2 days after Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender, the world celebrated victory. Champagne flowed in Times Square. Soldiers kissed their sweethearts. The war was over. But in a command post outside Frankfurt, one American general was not celebrating. George S. Patton stood before a map of Europe, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips. His eyes were not on the defeated enemy behind him. They were fixed eastward, toward the Elbe River, where American and Soviet forces had just shaken hands in a meeting that felt more like a farewell than a friendship. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and said to his aides what he had been thinking for weeks. We should keep our boots on. The real enemy is still out there. What Patton proposed next would shock the world. He wanted to rearm the Germans, the very soldiers America had just defeated, outfit them with American weapons, and march them east alongside U.S. forces to confront Joseph Stalin before the Red Army could tighten its grip on Eastern Europe. It was a plan so radical, so unthinkable, that when word reached Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister's response would reveal a terrifying truth. The victors of World War II were already preparing for the next great conflict. This is the story of the general who saw the Cold War coming before it began. And the warning the world refused to hear. The Reich Chancellery in Berlin smoldered beneath a sky choked with ash. The smell of burnt stone and rusted iron lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of spring blossoms that had somehow survived the bombardment. In a modest command post outside Frankfurt, General George S. Patton, Jr. stood before a map of Europe, his jaw set, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips. The war in Europe had been over for 2 days. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Yet Patton's eyes were not on the past. They were fixed eastward, toward the Elbe River, where American and Soviet forces had met in a handshake that now felt more like a farewell than a greeting. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and said to his aides what he had been thinking for weeks. We should keep our boots on. The real enemy is still out there. What Patton proposed in those tense days of May 1945 was not a celebration of victory. It was a warning, a radical, unthinkable plan that would have stunned the world. Rearm the Germans, the very soldiers who had just been defeated, and march them east alongside American forces to confront Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union before the Red Army could solidify its grip on Eastern Europe. It was a proposal born of fear, foresight, and fury. And when word of it reached Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister's response would reveal not only the fracture lines within the Allied coalition, but the terrible paradox that peace had delivered. The victors of World War II were already preparing for the next great conflict. The end of the war in Europe did not bring the euphoria many had imagined. Yes, there were celebrations in Times Square and Trafalgar Square, champagne toasts, and tearful reunions. But in the upper echelon of military and political leadership, a darker realization was setting in. The alliance that had defeated Hitler, an alliance forged in desperation between capitalist democracies and communist totalitarianism, was already beginning to fracture. The cracks had been visible for months. At Yalta in February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had gathered to carve up the post-war world. Stalin had promised free elections in Poland. He promised cooperation, but by May, it was clear those promises were written in smoke. Soviet forces had occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The Red Army was not liberating, it was conquering. Patton saw this with brutal clarity. Unlike many of his peers who still believed diplomacy could manage Stalin, Patton had no illusions. He had spent the final months of the war racing across Germany, not just to defeat the Nazis, but to reach as much territory as possible before the Soviets did. He had seen the way Soviet soldiers operated in occupied zones, looting, brutalizing, installing puppet governments. He had spoken with German civilians who feared the Russians far more than they had ever feared the Americans. And he had come to a conclusion that, to him, was obvious. The United States had just helped one tyrant destroy another, and now the greater tyrant stood unchallenged. In late May 1945, Patton met with his staff and floated the idea that would later be reported in his diaries and correspondence. He suggested that the United States should immediately rearm 10 to 12 German divisions, veteran Wehrmacht soldiers who knew Soviet tactics, who had fought on the Eastern Front, who understood the terrain and the enemy. These divisions, Patton argued, could be outfitted with American weapons, supplied by American logistics and led under American command. Together with American and British forces, they could strike east, while the Red Army was still exhausted from its drive to Berlin. The goal was not to conquer the Soviet Union. It was to push the Soviets back behind their pre-war borders, to force Stalin to honor his agreements, to prevent the enslavement of Eastern Europe. It was a plan born of Patton's deepest convictions. He despised communism with the same fervor he had once despised Nazism. To him, they were two sides of the same totalitarian coin. He believed the American soldier, backed by American tanks, American aircraft, and American industrial might, was invincible, and he believed that the window to act was closing fast. Every day the United States delayed, the Red Army dug in deeper. Every day Stalin's grip tightened. But Patton's proposal was not merely a military fantasy. It was rooted in the cold logic of what he had witnessed. The German Wehrmacht, even in defeat, was a formidable force. These were not the broken, demoralized conscripts of 1918. These were soldiers who had held off the combined might of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain for years. They had pioneered blitzkrieg tactics, developed advanced tank doctrine, and fought with a discipline that had stunned their enemies. Patton respected them as warriors, even as he loathed what they had fought for, and he believed that given a new cause, freedom over tyranny, the West over the East, they could be turned into an asset. When word of Patton's plan reached Washington, it was met with shock and outrage. Secretary of War Henry Stimson reportedly called it insane. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Patton's superior, was appalled. Eisenhower had spent the war building and maintaining the Allied coalition. He understood that the United States could not have defeated Germany without Soviet manpower. The Red Army had bled the Wehrmacht white on the Eastern Front, absorbing casualties in the millions, while American forces were still gearing up. To turn around now and rearm the Germans against the Soviets would be seen as a betrayal of staggering proportions. It would fracture the alliance, isolate the United States, and potentially ignite a war that would make World War II look like a prelude. But it was Churchill's response that would prove most revealing. The British Prime Minister had long harbored his own suspicions about Stalin. As early as 1944, Churchill had begun to worry about Soviet expansionism. He had pushed for the Allies to invade Europe through the Balkans rather than France, hoping to cut off Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He had clashed with Roosevelt over the future of Poland, and in the final weeks of the war, he had watched with growing alarm as the Red Army occupied territory after territory, installing communist governments and silencing dissent. Churchill was no friend of Stalin, but he was also a realist. In private conversations and correspondence, Churchill expressed sympathy for Patton's concerns. He agreed that the Soviet Union posed a long-term threat. He agreed that Stalin could not be trusted. In fact, just weeks after Germany's surrender, Churchill would commission a secret military study codenamed Operation Unthinkable, a plan to assess the feasibility of an Anglo-American attack on Soviet forces in Europe. The study concluded that such an attack would require a massive mobilization, would likely fail to dislodge the Red Army, and could result in Soviet forces reaching the Atlantic coast. It was, as the name suggested, unthinkable. But Churchill's response to Patton's specific proposal, rearming the Germans, was more cautious. He understood the military logic. The German soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and motivated by hatred of the Soviets. But he also understood the political impossibility. The British public had just endured 6 years of war. They had been bombed, rationed, and bled dry. The idea of rearming the enemy they had just defeated, of sending British and German soldiers to fight side by side, was politically toxic. More than that, it risked uniting the Soviet Union with global opinion against the West. Stalin would portray it as proof that the capitalist powers had always planned to destroy communism, that the alliance had been a sham, that the real enemy had always been the Soviet people. So Churchill did what he did best. He spoke in private and in code. He told aides that Patton was right in spirit, wrong in timing. He acknowledged that the West would eventually have to confront the Soviet threat, but he insisted that the time was not now. The United States and Britain were war-weary. Their publics demanded peace. The atomic bomb, successfully tested in July 1945, offered a new deterrent, a new form of leverage. Churchill believed that the West could contain Soviet expansion through political pressure, economic aid, and the implicit threat of nuclear annihilation. Open war was not the answer. And so Patton's plan died in the bureaucratic corridors of Washington and London. Eisenhower quietly reprimanded him. Patton was forbidden from making any further public statements about the Soviets. He was reassigned to a less prominent command in Bavaria, where he would spend his final months overseeing the occupation and growing increasingly bitter. In December 1945, Patton was critically injured in a car accident under circumstances that some would later call suspicious. He died on December 21st, 1945, without ever seeing his warnings taken seriously. But Patton had been right about one thing. The Cold War was already beginning. Even as the ink dried on the surrender documents, even as the Nuremberg trials prepared to prosecute Nazi war criminals, the next great conflict was taking shape. Stalin had no intention of withdrawing from Eastern Europe. By 1948, Czechoslovakia would fall to a communist coup. By 1949, the Berlin blockade would bring the world to the brink of war. By 1950, Soviet-backed North Korea would invade South Korea, drawing the United States into another brutal conflict. And in the years that followed, the United States would find itself doing exactly what Patton had proposed, rearming former enemies to confront the Soviet threat. West Germany would be rebuilt, rearmed, and integrated into NATO. Japanese forces would be reconstituted to counter Soviet influence in Asia. The very idea that had seemed unthinkable in 1945 became policy by 1950. The tragedy was not that Patton had been wrong. The tragedy was that he had been premature. His proposal came at a moment when the political will to act did not exist, when the machinery of alliance still held sway, when the hope for peace still outweighed the fear of tyranny. But within 5 years, that hope would evaporate. The Iron Curtain would descend. The world would divide into two armed camps. And the question would no longer be whether to confront the Soviet Union, but how. What drove Patton's thinking was not mere paranoia or warmongering. It was a fundamental belief in the superiority of the American system, the abundance, the freedom, the technological and industrial might that had crushed the Axis powers. Patton had seen what American logistics could do. He had commanded armies supplied by an endless stream of trucks, tanks, fuel, ammunition, and food. He had watched as American factories churned out more ships, more planes, more guns than the rest of the world combined. He had seen German prisoners of war stare in disbelief at the quality of American rations, the abundance of American medical care, the sheer material wealth that American soldiers took for granted, and he had concluded that this abundance was not just a tactical advantage, it was a moral one. The United States, in Patton's view, represented a form of civilization that was worth defending at any cost. It was a society where men were free to speak, to work, to prosper. It was a society where the individual mattered, where ambition was rewarded, where tyranny was rejected. And it was a society that, if necessary, could marshal its resources to fight any enemy on earth. This belief was not unique to Patton. It was shared by millions of Americans who had lived through the Great Depression and emerged into a world where American power seemed limitless. They had seen their fathers and brothers return from Europe and the Pacific with stories of liberation, of grateful populations, of enemies who had underestimated American resolve. They had seen photographs of German cities reduced to rubble, of Japanese war criminals on trial, of the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they had concluded that the American way of life was not just different, it was better. But this belief also carried a dangerous edge. It bred overconfidence. It encouraged the idea that American power could solve any problem, that American values were universal, that American will was unbreakable. It ignored the limits of military force, the complexities of foreign cultures, the exhaustion of populations who had endured too much war, and it set the stage for decades of conflict in which the United States would intervene, rebuild, arm, and fight in the name of defending freedom, often with mixed results, often at great cost. The symbolic object that runs through this story is not a weapon or a piece of technology. It is a map. The map of Europe that Patton studied in May 1945, marked with the positions of Allied and Soviet forces. It was a map that showed the world as it was, divided, occupied, uncertain. But it was also a map that showed the world as Patton believed it could be, a world where the line between freedom and tyranny was clear, where American power could be projected without hesitation, where the mistakes of appeasement would not be repeated. Patton kept that map on his desk throughout his final months. He traced the Soviet positions with his finger, calculating distances, supply routes, likely points of resistance. He showed it to visitors, pointing out how vulnerable the Red Army was, how overstretched, how dependent on rail lines that could be cut with air power. He argued that the opportunity to act was slipping away, that every day of delay allowed Stalin to consolidate his gains, to fortify his positions, to prepare for the inevitable conflict. But the map also represented something Patton could not see. It represented the limits of military solutions. It showed territory, but not the will of populations. It showed armies, but not the political realities that constrained them. It showed borders, but not the human cost of redrawing them. The map was a tool of war, and Patton was a warrior. He understood war, but he did not fully understand peace. The fragile, frustrating, imperfect process of rebuilding, reconciling, and coexisting. And so the map remained on his desk, a relic of a war that had ended and a war that would never begin. When Patton died in December 1945, the map was packed away with his personal effects. It was never used to plan the campaign he had envisioned, but the questions it raised about the price of victory, the nature of peace, the responsibility of power, would echo through the decades that followed. Churchill, for his part, never forgot the conversation. In his post-war memoirs, he would write extensively about the Soviet threat, about the failure of the Western Allies to push back against Stalin's expansion, about the missed opportunities to shape the post-war order. He would coin the term Iron Curtain to describe the division of Europe. He would warn that the West had traded one form of tyranny for another, that the victory over Nazism had come at the cost of handing half of Europe to communism. But he would also admit that the alternative, open war with the Soviet Union in 1945, was not realistic. The British Empire was bankrupt, its people exhausted. The United States, despite its power, was eager to demobilize, to bring its soldiers home, to return to the business of peacetime prosperity. The public appetite for another war simply did not exist, and the political risks, alienating the Soviet Union, fracturing the United Nations before it even began, appearing to betray the alliance that had won the war, were too great. Churchill understood what Patton did not, that politics, not military strategy, would determine the shape of the post-war world. And in the politics of 1945, there was no room for Patton's plan. The alliance with Stalin had to be maintained, if only for appearances. The hope for cooperation had to be preserved, even as the evidence mounted that it was futile. The machinery of diplomacy had to be given a chance, even as the military realities on the ground suggested otherwise. It was a tragic compromise, a choice to delay the inevitable, to hope for the best, to avoid a war that would come anyway in different forms. Churchill knew it. Patton knew it. And in the decades that followed, the world would pay the price. The German soldiers Patton wanted to rearm had their own perspective on this moment. For them, the end of World War II was not a liberation. It was a catastrophe. They had fought for 6 years, enduring the winter snows of Russia, the deserts of North Africa, the rubble of Stalingrad, and Berlin. They had believed, many of them, that they were defending their homeland against Bolshevism, against the Soviet hordes that threatened to sweep across Europe. And when the war ended, they found themselves prisoners of the very enemy they had been taught to fear. In Soviet-occupied zones, German POWs faced brutal conditions. They were forced into labor camps, subjected to starvation and abuse, used as pawns in Stalin's efforts to extract reparations and rebuild the Soviet economy. Hundreds of thousands would die in captivity. Those who survived would return to a Germany divided, occupied, stripped of sovereignty. In American and British zones, conditions were better. The Western Allies provided food, medical care, and a degree of dignity. But there was no escaping the sense of defeat, the humiliation of occupation, the uncertainty of what came next. Many German soldiers despised the Soviets more than they despised the American. They saw the Americans as honorable enemies, as soldiers who fought by rules, who treated prisoners fairly, who represented a way of life that, while foreign, was at least comprehensible. And so when rumors circulated in POW camps that the Americans might rearm German units to fight the Soviets, there was interest. Not universal, not unanimous, but real. Some soldiers saw it as a chance for redemption, a way to continue the fight they believed they had been waging all along. Others saw it as a pragmatic necessity, a recognition that the Soviet threat had not ended with Germany's defeat. Still, others simply wanted to survive, to find purpose in a world that had been shattered. But the rumors remained rumors. The rearming never happened, not in 1945. And the German soldiers, who had hoped for a new mission, found themselves instead facing denazification trials, reconstruction efforts, and a long, painful process of reckoning with what their nation had done. The irony of Patton's proposal is that, in a sense, it came true. Not immediately, not in the way he envisioned, but gradually over the course of the Cold War. By 1955, West Germany was admitted into NATO. The Bundeswehr, the new German armed forces, were established and equipped with American weapons. Former Wehrmacht officers were recruited to train and lead these new units. The very soldiers Patton had wanted to rearm in 1945 were, a decade later, integrated into the Western Alliance to stand against the Soviet Union. The same process unfolded in Japan. By 1950, the United States was encouraging the creation of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces, rearming the nation it had defeated 5 years earlier to counter Soviet and Chinese influence in Asia. The logic was identical: former enemies, now transformed into allies, deployed to contain the spread of communism, but the cost of delaying was enormous. In the years between 1945 and 1950, millions of people in Eastern Europe and Asia fell under communist rule. The chance to prevent the division of Europe, the chance to stop Stalin before he consolidated power, was lost. The Cold War, which might have been a brief confrontation in 1945, became a decades-long struggle that spanned the globe, cost trillions of dollars, and brought the world repeatedly to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Patton had seen this coming. He had warned that the window to act was narrow, that every day of delay made the problem worse. He had been dismissed as a warmonger, a reckless cowboy, a man too eager to fight, but history would prove that his instincts, if not his timing, were sound. The epilogue of this story is not about vindication. It is about the tragic nature of foresight. Patton saw the future clearly, but he lacked the power to change it. Churchill understood the political realities, but he lacked the will to defy them. The German soldiers wanted a new cause, but they were denied the chance to choose it. And the American and British publics, exhausted by war, wanted peace, even if that peace was an illusion. The map on Patton's desk was never used for the campaign he imagined, but it became a symbol of the choices the West faced in 1945: to confront tyranny immediately, at great cost, or to delay and hope for the best. The West chose delay, and the cost was paid over decades, in divided cities and proxy wars, in arms races and ideological struggles, in the slow, grinding confrontation that defined the second half of the 20th century. Patton died believing he had failed, but his warning lived on. It lived on in the policies of containment, in the doctrine of deterrence, in the understanding that totalitarianism could not be appeased, only confronted. It lived on in the rebuilt armies of West Germany and Japan, in the alliances that held the line against Soviet expansion, in the ultimate victory of the Cold War. And it lived on in the question that Patton's proposal forced the world to ask: when tyranny rises, when the choice is between war now and war later, which path leads to less suffering? Patton believed the answer was war now. History suggests he may have been right, but history also teaches that the world is not run by prophets. It is run by politicians, by publics, by the exhausted and the hopeful, by those who choose compromise over confrontation, delay over decisiveness. And so the map remained folded, the plan unexecuted, the warning unheeded, until the Cold War began in earnest and the world realized too late that Patton had seen what was coming. By then, he was gone, but his words echoed across the decades. The real enemy is still out there, and the West finally began to listen.